The first message came out of the darkness at exactly the wrong time. Not from a tank, not from a gun, but from a radio. A burst of dots and dashes cut through the night, sharp and deliberate, tapping out orders that did not exist. Reports of troop movements that were never made. Requests for supplies meant for units that were not there. Somewhere inside German headquarters, officers leaned closer to their receivers. Maps were unfolded, units were shifted. Men were moved to meet an enemy that, on paper, was suddenly everywhere. What the Wehrmacht did not know was that the signal came from a single room, a cramped space, a flickering light, and a teenager with shaking hands. He was too young to shave, too young to vote, too young by every rule of war to be fighting at all. And yet, with a homemade transmitter and a stolen codebook, he had just begun one of the most audacious acts of deception in the Second World War. This is the story of the teenager who fooled the Wehrmacht with fake radio traffic. Before the war reached him, his world was small. A narrow street, a modest home, a country already tense with rumors and whispers. He grew up hearing adults lower their voices when the radio was on, watching faces harden at the mention of Germany. When the invasion came, it came fast. Boots on cobblestone, engines growling through once quiet towns, flags torn down and replaced overnight. Occupation did not announce itself with a single moment of horror. It arrived in layers. Curfews, ration cards, new laws posted on walls in languages not his own, soldiers who watched too closely, questions asked too often. He was still in school when the first arrests began. Neighbors disappeared, teachers stopped showing up, shops closed without explanation. The teenager learned quickly what it meant to survive under occupation. You listened more than you spoke. You memorized faces. You learned which streets to avoid after dark. And you learned that information was more powerful than any weapon. He had always been good with radios. As a child, he spent hours taking them apart, spreading their insides across the table, trying to understand how invisible waves could carry voices across entire countries. To him, it felt like magic made logical, a puzzle that could be solved. When the Germans confiscated civilian radios, he hid one. When they banned listening to foreign broadcasts, he listened anyway. Late at night, under blankets, he tuned in to voices from far away. London, free Europe, signals that slipped past German censors and reminded occupied nations that the war was not over. That was where he first heard about resistance networks, about coded messages hidden inside music programs, about agents who spoke through static, about wars being fought not just with bullets, but with lies carefully told. The idea stayed with him. At first, he only passed messages, short notes, addresses, names whispered in kitchens and stairwells. He was small, forgettable, the kind of boy soldiers waved past without a second glance. That made him useful. Then one night, everything changed. A resistance operator he knew did not return. The radio went silent, the safe house was empty, and by morning, German patrols were everywhere. The teenager understood what silence meant: capture, interrogation, death if they were lucky. The resistance needed a radio operator immediately, someone who could keep traffic alive, maintain the illusion that nothing had gone wrong. There was no one else, so the boy stepped forward. The transmitter was crude, parts scavenged from broken sets, wires soldered by hand. It barely worked, but it worked enough. The first time he pressed the key, his hands trembled so badly he almost dropped it. He knew the risks. German radio direction-finding units were relentless. Trucks equipped with antennas roamed cities and countryside alike, triangulating signals with terrifying speed. A signal that lasted too long could be a death sentence. Operators were taught to send quickly, 30 seconds, sometimes less. He had never done this under pressure before. He took a breath and began. At first, he followed instructions exactly. Routine reports, supply confirmations,
harmless details designed to keep the network alive. But the teenager was observant. He listened to German broadcasts, studied their procedures, learned how they phrased orders, how their units communicated, how officers expected information to flow. He realized something important. The Germans trusted their radios. Paper could be forged, people could lie, but radio traffic, especially when encrypted correctly, carried authority. And authority could be abused. The idea formed slowly, dangerously. What if he didn't just maintain traffic? What if he created it? The resistance leaders were hesitant. False radio traffic was risky. If discovered, it could compromise entire networks. But the teenager argued carefully. He had listened long enough. He knew the rhythms, the mistakes, the habits. And more importantly, he understood something the adults sometimes forgot. The Germans did not expect a child. They agreed to let him try once. One message, short, carefully constructed. He transmitted a report describing troop movement that mirrored real German operations, but placed them just far enough off to be plausible. A unit relocating, a delay due to mechanical failure, nothing dramatic. The message went out. Then they waited. Hours passed. No knock on the door, no trucks outside, no boots on the stairs. The next day, the resistance learned that a German patrol had been rerouted, a checkpoint abandoned, a search delayed. It worked. That single success changed everything. The teenager began to build a phantom war. Night after night, he sent messages describing units that existed only in his mind. Supply shortages that forced German commanders to divert resources, training exercises that explained away movements the resistance wanted hidden. He invented personalities, unit commanders with distinct styles, officers who complained, officers who bragged. He even built in mistakes, a wrong coordinate corrected minutes later, a request withdrawn after clarification. It made the traffic feel real. Inside German headquarters, analysts plotted these messages onto maps. Red pins multiplied, lines shifted. Decisions were made based on voices that were in truth coming from a boy sitting in the dark, heart racing, counting seconds before he had to stop transmitting. Each broadcast was a gamble. He learned to sweat silently, to ignore the sound of trucks outside, to kill the transmitter instantly if footsteps lingered too long. Once, during a transmission, a German vehicle stopped directly outside the building. The signal was live, the message unfinished. If he cut transmission abruptly, it could raise suspicion. If he continued, they could locate him. He finished the message calmly, ended with a routine sign-off, then destroyed the antenna connection and hid the transmitter just as fists hammered on the door below. The soldiers searched the building. They questioned neighbors, turned over furniture, found nothing. The teenager sat on his bed, staring at the wall, barely breathing. After that night, the stakes escalated. German commanders began responding to his traffic, asking for clarifications, issuing counterorders. The boy answered them all. He had crossed a line. He was no longer maintaining deception, he was shaping it. The resistance leaders used his work to move people, to sabotage rail lines, to extract agents. German units arrived late, or early, or not at all. Somewhere along the way, the teenager stopped thinking of himself as a child. There was no room for fear anymore, only precision. But the Germans were not blind. Patterns began to emerge, signals that seemed too consistent, units that never made visual contact, orders that led to nowhere. German radio intelligence officers started asking questions, and when questions failed, they prepared traps. They sent challenges, subtle code variations, requests designed to expose imposters. The teenager recognized them immediately and answered anyway. He adjusted his tone, introduced frustration, delayed replies, let messages go unanswered long enough to feel human. It was a dance played out in static. One mistake would end it all. As winter closed in, German radio trucks returned to the streets in force. Direction-finding patrols intensified. Operators were being caught, sometimes with transmitters still warm. The resistance urged caution. Shorter transmissions, fewer messages. But the phantom army the teenager had created had grown too large to simply disappear. If it went silent now, it would confirm every suspicion. So he kept transmitting. Even as the net tightened. Even as friends vanished. Even as he began sleeping in different rooms, different buildings, never staying in one place too long. By the end of that winter, German forces were preparing for something big. A threat they could not.
The trap began with a pause, a silence that lasted just a little too long. For weeks, German radio traffic had followed familiar rhythms, requests, acknowledgments, corrections, the invisible conversation of an army at war with shadows. Then, one night, the replies changed. Shorter, sharper, unusual phrasing buried inside otherwise normal orders. The teenager noticed it immediately. These were not mistakes, they were probes. The Germans were no longer just listening, they were testing. He slowed his breathing and answered anyway, carefully, precisely, matching the altered phrasing without copying it outright. Minutes later, a response came back. Acknowledged. It should have reassured him. Instead, his stomach tightened, because acknowledgement meant they were still watching. German radio intelligence had reached a conclusion. Someone was lying. Direction-finding units were redeployed, not randomly this time, but methodically. Grids tightened, intersections were mapped, entire neighborhoods were placed under observation. The teenager learned this from whispers in the resistance network. Operators were being caught faster now, transmitters seized within minutes of going live, houses burned after searches turned violent. The phantom army had drawn too much attention. Resistance leaders debated pulling the plug entirely, shutting down all traffic and disappearing into silence. But silence now would scream guilt. The teenager understood what that meant. If the deception ended abruptly, German forces would reassign units immediately. They would flood areas that had been spared. They would hunt down anyone who had benefited from the confusion. The lie had to end naturally, or it had to end loudly enough to matter. He proposed one final operation, a climax big enough to justify everything that came before it. German command had been reacting for months to his fictional units. He now planned to weaponize that trust one last time. The message would describe a major resistance-backed offensive, a buildup, a threat too serious to ignore. If it worked, German forces would concentrate away from real resistance targets just long enough for decisive action. If it failed, the teenager would not survive the night. The resistance hesitated. This was not sabotage anymore. This was strategic manipulation at the highest level. But the opportunity was real. Rail lines vulnerable, safe evacuations planned, entire networks ready to move if given the slightest opening. They agreed. The boy prepared the message slowly. He constructed it like a confession whispered in code. Multiple units reporting readiness, supply requests escalating, coordinates aligning into a pattern that screamed urgency. He added fear. Not panic, fear controlled just enough to feel real. Then he waited for the right moment, when German radio traffic peaked, when analysts were overwhelmed, when one more report would blend into the noise. Late at night, he powered up the transmitter. His hands were steady now. He sent the first message, then another,
then a confirmation from a second fictional unit, responding exactly as German procedures demanded. Within minutes, replies flooded back, orders issued, requests for clarification, urgent demands for timing and strength. The teenager answered them all. For nearly 3 minutes, the transmitter stayed live. 3 minutes was an eternity. Direction-finding teams would already be moving. He ended the transmission and dismantled the setup in seconds. Wires cut, components scattered, the radio hidden inside a hollow wall. Then he ran. Not far, not fast, just enough to disappear into the city's breathing darkness. That night, German forces moved. Convoys rumbled toward the Phantom Front. Troops redeployed from rail hubs. Patrols abandoned sectors the resistance needed cleared. And in those abandoned spaces, the real war finally struck. Tracks were blown, bridges collapsed, safe houses emptied without interference. Agents crossed borders, prisoners escaped, entire cells vanished into countryside the Germans thought secure. The teenager listened from hiding as distant explosions rolled through the night. The lie had worked. But lies leave echoes. At dawn, German command realized the truth. Reports from the front found nothing, no resistance buildup, no enemy formations, only empty roads and ruined infrastructure. Radio intelligence officers traced the deception backward, reviewed transcripts, replayed messages. They found consistency, skill, intent. This had not been a group of amateurs. This had been one operator, and they wanted him alive. Roadblocks snapped into place, buildings were sealed, door-to-door searches resumed with renewed brutality. The teenager knew what was coming. He destroyed everything he could not carry, burned notes, crushed components, erased patterns that might lead back to him. Then he went to ground. For days he moved only at night, slept in cellars, attics, abandoned spaces that smelled of dust and fear. He ate little, drank less. The city was no longer safe. German radio trucks swept block by block, antennas turning slowly like hunting dogs tasting the air. Once he watched from a window as soldiers dragged a suspected operator into the street. The man screamed only once. The teenager did not look away. He needed to remember what failure looked like. Eventually, the resistance made the decision for him. He was too valuable, too compromised. They arranged his extraction. It would not be heroic, no dramatic escape, just a quiet movement through gaps opened by chaos he himself had created. One night, under forged papers and borrowed clothes, the teenager walked past a checkpoint manned by soldiers who had spent months chasing his voice without ever seeing his face. They waved him through. He did not look back. Across borders, through safe houses, across terrain scarred by war, he finally reached a place where the radio sounded different, where voices were not whispered, where the war was still brutal, but no longer hidden. There he told his story. Intelligence officers listened in disbelief. A single teenage operator? A fabricated order of battle? Months of sustained deception? They verified it piece by piece. German archives later confirmed the damage. Misallocated divisions, delayed offensives, resources wasted on enemies that never existed, lives saved by time bought through lies. The teenager never returned to the radio room. He trained others, advised planners, explained how trust could be built and broken through tone alone. When the war ended, his story did not make headlines. There were no medals pinned in public ceremonies, no photographs, no triumphant speeches. That was intentional. Radio deception thrived on anonymity. So did survival. For years, his role remained classified, buried inside reports stamped secret and forgotten inside archives. He grew older, built a life, learned how to live without counting seconds or listening for trucks outside his door. Only later, when records were opened and survivors spoke, did the shape of his work become clear. Historians struggled to believe it. A teenager had outmaneuvered professional military intelligence units, had turned their own procedures against them, had forced an occupying army to fight ghosts. But those who understood radio warfare knew the truth. Wars are not only won by strength, they are won by belief. The Wehrmacht believed in the authority of its signals, believed that encrypted messages meant reality, believed that no child could command an army through static. That belief cost them time. Time is everything in war. Time lets trains be sabotaged. Time lets prisoners escape. Time lets resistance survive long enough to matter. The teenager never called himself a hero. When asked about fear, he said it was always there, sitting beside him, waiting for the key to be pressed. What mattered was not courage, he said. What mattered was listening. Listening to the enemy, listening to patterns, listening long enough to know when a lie would sound more convincing than the truth. Today, radio towers rise everywhere. Signals cross continents in seconds. Deception has become digital, automated, invisible. But the principle remains the same. Somewhere, someone is listening. And somewhere else, someone is deciding what to believe. The teenager's war was fought in silence, carried on waves no one could see, spoken in a language